The roast had barely been placed on the table when my older brother Daniel stood up with a glass of wine in his hand. Smiling proudly, he looked around the room before raising his glass. "Here's to Grandpa's cabin," he said. "Finally sold after all these years." Laughter spread around the dining table. My mother smiled with obvious satisfaction as she nodded toward him. "It was about time," she said. "That old place was costing more money than it was worth." Then she turned to me. Her smile didn't disappear. It only became colder. "You don't have to look so disappointed, Claire," she said. "You were never going to inherit it anyway." The room became strangely quiet. Forks stopped moving. Conversations ended in the middle of sentences. Every person sitting around that Christmas table turned toward me, waiting to see how I would react. My aunt slowly lowered her coffee cup. My cousin looked away. Even the children seemed to notice something had changed. They expected me to argue or cry or remind everyone how much that cabin had meant to Grandpa. Instead, I calmly picked up my wine glass, took one slow sip, and placed it back on the table. Then I smiled, because nobody sitting in that dining room knew the truth. The cabin they believed had been sold already belonged to me. The papers had been signed nearly 3 weeks earlier. They simply hadn't discovered it yet. Before dessert was served, every person at that table would realize they had celebrated something that had never actually happened. But to understand how Christmas dinner became the quietest meal our family had ever shared, I need to take you back almost a year. My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 36 years old, and I own a small accounting office in a quiet town called Maple Ridge. I've always believed numbers tell the truth, even when people don't. That belief came from my grandfather, Arthur Morgan. He wasn't a lawyer or a businessman. He spent most of his life repairing engines in a small workshop beside his cabin. Yet somehow, he understood people better than anyone I've ever known. Grandpa's cabin sat beside Silver Pine Lake, surrounded by tall cedar trees that seemed to grow a little taller every time I visited. It wasn't luxurious. The roof leaked whenever spring storms rolled through. The porch leaned slightly toward the water. The fireplace smoked whenever the wind blew from the north. Most people would have called it an old cabin. Grandpa called it home. And to me, it was the safest place in the world. Some of my happiest memories were made there. Grandpa taught me how to split firewood without wasting energy. He showed me how to repair broken chairs instead of throwing them away. Every spring we painted the fence together. Every autumn we stacked enough firewood to last through winter. Sometimes we worked for hours without saying a single word. We didn't need conversation to enjoy each other's company. Silence was never uncomfortable with Grandpa. It was peaceful. My mother rarely visited him. She always claimed the drive was too long or that she had too much to do. My brother Daniel usually stopped by only once or twice a year, and almost every visit ended the same way. He would stand on the porch, look across the lake, and tell Grandpa how much money the property was worth. "Developers are buying everything around here," he'd say. "You could sell this place tomorrow and never worry about money again." Grandpa always laughed. "Son," he'd reply, "I already wake up every morning looking at paradise. Why would I trade that for another bank account?" Daniel never understood what he meant. My younger sister Emily wasn't much different. She loved telling people stories about spending summers at Grandpa's cabin, but the truth was she hadn't stayed there for more than an hour in almost 6 years. She always had another excuse. The kids had soccer practice. Her husband had to work. Traffic was too heavy. Somehow there was always a reason not to visit, but never a reason to stop talking about the property whenever the family gathered together. I visited every Saturday. Sometimes I brought groceries. Sometimes I helped with paperwork or balanced Grandpa's checkbook. Other times we simply sat on the porch drinking coffee while watching the sunrise over the lake. One October afternoon, only a few weeks before he died, we were sitting beside the fireplace when he looked at me differently than usual. His expression wasn't sad, but it was serious. "Claire," he said quietly, "I need you to promise me something." I smiled and joked that I should probably hear the request before making promises. He laughed softly, then looked around the cabin. "No matter what happens after I'm gone," he said, "don't let strangers erase this place." I immediately told him he wasn't going anywhere. He smiled, but it wasn't the same smile he usually wore. There was something final about it, something that made my stomach tighten. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Promise me anyway." So I did. I promised him I'd protect the cabin. At the time, I thought I was simply comforting an old man. I had no idea that promise would soon become the most important one I'd ever make. 3 weeks later, my phone rang just before sunrise. It was the hospital. Grandpa Arthur had passed away peacefully during the night. The world suddenly felt quieter. Not empty, just different. 4 days later, family and friends gathered to say goodbye. The church was filled with people whose lives Grandpa had quietly changed over the years. Neighbors whose tractors he'd repaired without charging them. Families he'd helped after storms. Children he'd taught how to fish. Everyone had a story about his kindness. Everyone except my own family. While other people remembered Grandpa, my family discussed something else entirely. I overheard my brother estimating how much the property was worth. My mother wondered how quickly it could be sold. My uncle mentioned developers who had been trying to buy land around the lake for years. Standing beside Grandpa's casket, I realized something that broke my heart even more than losing him. Some of us had come there to mourn a man. Others had come to calculate the value of what he left behind. As everyone prepared to leave the cemetery, I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and felt the small brass key Grandpa had given me 2 days before he died. He had pressed it into my hand without explaining what it opened. He simply smiled and whispered, "When the time is right, you'll know." Standing there beside his grave, I still had no idea what he meant. But before Christmas arrived, I was about to discover exactly why Grandpa trusted me, and why everyone else in my family had misunderstood him until the very end. The funeral ended just before sunset. One by one, the neighbors returned to their homes, the flowers were carried away, and the church parking lot slowly emptied until only family remained. My mother stood beside her car, talking about paperwork. Daniel was already making phone calls. Emily was asking whether anyone knew how much property taxes had increased around Silver Pine Lake. I stood quietly near Grandpa's old pickup truck, wondering how 3 people could leave a funeral talking about everything except the man they had just buried. As everyone prepared to leave, our family lawyer, Mr. Collins, walked toward me carrying a small brown envelope. He wasn't smiling. He simply held it out and said, "Arthur asked me to give this to you, and only to you." Before I could ask any questions, he quietly added, "He was very specific." My mother immediately noticed the envelope. "What's that?" she asked. Mr. Collins looked at her politely before answering. "Just a personal item your father wanted Claire to have." My mother forced a smile, but I recognized that expression. It was the same smile she wore whenever she believed someone else had received something she deserved. I waited until I got home before opening the envelope. Inside, there wasn't any money, no letter, no legal document. There was only a small folded piece of paper with Grandpa's familiar handwriting. I unfolded it carefully. It contained just one sentence. "The key belongs to the place where truth waits patiently." That was all. No explanation, no address, no signature. Just one sentence. I read it 5 times, hoping the meaning would suddenly become obvious. It didn't. The brass key still rested in my pocket, and now I had a message that made even less sense than the key itself. For the first time, I wondered if Grandpa had been trying to tell me something during those final weeks, something I had completely missed. The following Monday, I returned to work. Running a small accounting office means life doesn't stop simply because your heart is broken. Payroll still has deadlines. Tax returns still need filing. Clients still expect answers. I buried myself in numbers because numbers were predictable, unlike grief. Yet no matter how hard I tried to focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to Grandpa's message. The key belongs to the place where truth waits patiently. What place? His cabin? The workshop? The bank? Nothing seemed to fit. 3 days later, my mother called a family meeting. According to her, it was time to discuss Grandpa's estate. We gathered at my parents' house that Thursday evening. The atmosphere felt strangely cheerful, almost like everyone had been waiting for this moment. Coffee was already on the table. Daniel had brought a notebook. Emily arrived carrying brochures from 2 different real estate companies. Seeing those brochures sitting beside Grandma's old china made something inside me tighten. Mr. Collins arrived exactly at 7 o'clock, carrying a thick leather folder. He greeted everyone politely before sitting down at the head of the dining table. "Arthur's estate is fairly straightforward," he began. "There are savings, investment accounts, the cabin, and approximately 22 acres surrounding the lake." Before he could continue, Daniel interrupted. "So, when can we list the property?" Mr. Collins paused for a moment before answering. "We're here to read the will first." Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking slightly embarrassed, but only slightly. My mother reached over and patted his arm. "He's just trying to think ahead," she said. "The market is excellent right now." Mr. Collins opened the folder and adjusted his glasses. The room became silent. Grandpa had left small donations to the local church, the volunteer fire department, and the animal shelter where he'd adopted his old Labrador years earlier. That sounded exactly like him. Then came several personal gifts. His fishing boat went to an old friend. His collection of woodworking tools was donated to the community vocational school. His pickup truck went to the young mechanic who had worked beside him for almost 10 years. Daniel frowned. Emily crossed her arms. Neither of them seemed interested until Mr. Collins finally reached the final page. As for the remaining estate, everyone leaned forward. "The savings accounts will be divided equally between Arthur's 3 children." My mother smiled. "The investment accounts will also be divided equally." Daniel nodded happily. Then Mr. Collins stopped reading. He looked directly at me, then back down at the document. "The cabin," he continued slowly, "cannot be sold, transferred, or listed for sale until specific legal instructions left by Arthur Morgan have been completed." The room fell silent. Daniel frowned. "What legal instructions?" Mr. Collins closed the folder. "I'm afraid I can't answer that today." "What do you mean you can't answer?" my mother asked. "Because Arthur specifically instructed me not to." Daniel laughed. "What kind of nonsense is that?" Mr. Collins remained perfectly calm. Arthur anticipated that question. He reached into his folder, removed another sealed envelope, and placed it gently on the table. Across the front, in Grandpa's handwriting, were 6 simple words. "For Claire, when the time is right." Every person at that table stared at the envelope. My mother spoke first. "Why does she keep getting envelopes?" Mr. Collins looked directly at her. "Because that's what Arthur instructed." The room suddenly felt much smaller. Daniel shook his head. "So what are we supposed to do now?" Mr. Collins answered without hesitation. "You wait." "For how long?" Emily asked. He looked down at Grandpa's written instructions one final time. "Until Claire decides it's time." Nobody said another word. As I picked up the sealed envelope, I felt the small brass key inside my pocket again. For the second time since Grandpa's funeral, he had reached into the future, and somehow he was still one step ahead of everyone in the room. I didn't open the envelope right away. I carried it home, placed it on my kitchen table, and simply stared at it for nearly an hour. The brass key Grandpa had given me sat beside it, catching the afternoon sunlight every time I walked past the window. Together, they looked like 2 ordinary objects. But nothing about them felt ordinary anymore. Grandpa had never been the kind of man who enjoyed mysteries. If he wanted you to know something, He simply told you. Which meant there had to be a reason he was making me discover the truth one step at a time. Finally, I slid my finger beneath the seal and unfolded the letter inside. It was only one page, written entirely in Grandpa's careful handwriting. Claire, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm sorry you have to carry this alone. I wanted to tell you everything myself, but sometimes people only listen after we're gone. The key in your pocket opens Safe Deposit Box 212 at First County Bank. Everything you need is waiting there. Go alone and trust no one until you've seen it with your own eyes. That was all. No explanation. No hint about what was inside the box. Just another set of instructions. I read the letter 3 times before folding it back exactly the way Grandpa had folded it himself. Then I looked at the brass key resting beside me. Safe Deposit Box 212. Suddenly, the sentence from his first note finally made sense. The key belongs to the place where truth waits patiently. The truth had been sitting inside a bank, waiting for me all along. The next morning, I drove to First County Bank before opening my office. It was an old brick building in the center of town, the kind of place where everyone still knew your name before you reached the counter. Grandpa had banked there for over 40 years. The manager recognized me immediately and offered her condolences before I even spoke. When I explained why I was there, her expression changed. She disappeared into a back office for several minutes before returning with a thick folder. "Mr. Morgan left very specific instructions," she said quietly. "He added your name to the safe deposit box several years ago. You're authorized to access it immediately." Several years ago. I wasn't expecting that. Grandpa hadn't made this decision during his illness. He had planned it long before anyone knew he was dying. The manager led me downstairs into the bank vault. Rows of steel boxes covered the walls from floor to ceiling. She stopped in front of box number 212, inserted the bank's master key, then stepped back. "The second key is yours." My hands shook slightly as I inserted Grandpa's brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost effortlessly, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The manager removed the metal box and carried it into a small private room before quietly leaving me alone. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Whatever Grandpa wanted me to know, it was inside. I slowly lifted the lid. The box wasn't filled with money. There weren't stacks of cash or gold or jewelry. Instead, everything inside was perfectly organized. A leather folder, several sealed envelopes, property documents, old photographs, and one final handwritten letter resting neatly on top. Across the front, in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, were 6 simple words: "Read this before anything else." I smiled through tears. Even now, Grandpa was still telling me exactly what to do. I unfolded the letter carefully. "Claire, if you've made it this far, then you've already proven something important. You listened. Most people spend their lives looking for quick answers. I always knew you would be patient enough to find the right ones." I felt tears beginning to fill my eyes. The letter continued. "I'm leaving you something much bigger than a cabin. But before you understand what it is, you need to understand why. For years, I've watched people visit this place only when they needed something. Some wanted money, others wanted land, very few wanted time. You never came because you expected an inheritance. You came because you believed no one should grow old alone. That difference matters more than you'll ever know." I stopped reading for a moment. The room suddenly felt much smaller. For years, I had quietly wondered whether Grandpa noticed the difference between those who visited out of love and those who visited out of obligation. Now I had my answer. He had noticed everything. With trembling hands, I turned to the next page. Attached beneath Grandpa's letter, secured neatly with a paperclip, was a document that immediately caught my attention. The title at the top read, "Warranty Deed." I frowned. Why would the deed to the cabin be inside a safe deposit box? Slowly, I lowered my eyes to the line that identified the owner. The moment I read the name, my heart completely stopped. Because the owner listed on the deed wasn't my grandfather anymore, and it wasn't my mother or my brother or anyone else in my family. It was me. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. I read the deed again, then a third time, convinced I had misunderstood something. But the name never changed. Mine was printed there in black ink, perfectly clear, exactly where the owner's name belonged. The document had been signed almost 18 months earlier, witnessed by 2 attorneys, recorded with the county, and stamped with the official seal. Grandpa hadn't planned to leave me the cabin after he died. He had quietly transferred ownership while he was still alive. I leaned back in the chair and covered my mouth with my hand. Suddenly, every conversation we'd shared during the past year began replaying in my mind. Every time Grandpa had asked whether I was happy, every time he reminded me to keep copies of important paperwork, every time he smiled whenever Daniel talked about selling the property. It all made sense now. Grandpa wasn't listening because he was curious. He was listening because he already knew something none of us did. I looked back inside the safe deposit box. Beneath the deed was another envelope, thicker this time, with my name written across the front. I carefully opened it and unfolded another letter. Claire, by the time you read this, the cabin legally belongs to you. It has for quite some time. I transferred it while my mind was clear because I didn't want anyone arguing over it after I was gone. I know exactly what your mother and brother will try to do. They'll believe they inherited something they never actually owned. Don't hate them for it, but don't let them take what was never theirs either. I stopped reading and stared out the small window in the private room. Grandpa had predicted everything. Not only had he protected the cabin, he had anticipated exactly how my family would react after his death. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. He had spent decades watching the same patterns repeat themselves until he knew how the story would unfold. The letter continued. People often mistake kindness for weakness, especially inside families. You've spent most of your life keeping the peace, apologizing when you did nothing wrong, and stepping aside so others could feel important. I love your heart for that, but this time, I need you to stand your ground. Protect this place, because once it's gone, it can never be brought back. Those words hit harder than anything else I'd read. Grandpa knew me better than I knew myself. He knew I would be tempted to avoid conflict, to keep everyone happy, even if it meant giving up something that mattered. He wasn't asking me to fight my family. He was asking me to stop surrendering to them. At the bottom of the letter, Grandpa had written one final instruction. Don't tell anyone yet. Just 4 words, simple, clear, and completely unexpected. I frowned. Why wouldn't he want me to tell the family? The deed was legal. Everything had been done properly. Why keep it secret? Then I noticed another folded page tucked behind the letter. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Mr. Collins, our family lawyer. I unfolded it carefully. If my family decides to sell the cabin after my death, allow them to believe they can. Do not reveal the transfer unless Claire chooses to do so herself. She deserves the chance to see who values memories and who values money. The truth will reveal more than any argument ever could. I slowly lowered the paper. Grandpa hadn't been testing legal documents. He had been testing people. The cabin was never in danger of being sold, because legally, nobody except me had the authority to sell it. Everything my family was planning, every conversation about developers, every discussion about listing the property, was based on something they didn't actually own. For the first time since Grandpa died, I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because I could almost picture him sitting in his old rocking chair, smiling quietly to himself, knowing exactly how this would unfold. As I placed the documents back into the box, my phone suddenly rang. The screen showed Daniel's name. I answered. "Hey, Claire," he said cheerfully. "Good news." "What happened?" "We've got an offer." I felt my heart skip. An offer for what? The cabin. He sounded almost excited. Some development company wants the whole property. Mom thinks we should accept before they change their minds. I looked down at the deed, still resting in front of me. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. Then Daniel laughed. "You still there?" "Yeah," I answered quietly. "I'm here." "So, you're okay with selling?" I looked once more at Grandpa's signature, then at the sentence he'd written only moments before. "Don't tell anyone yet." I smiled to myself and answered exactly the way Grandpa probably knew I would. "Do whatever you think is best." Daniel laughed with relief. "I knew you'd come around." After we hung up, I carefully placed every document back into the safe deposit box, except one, the deed. I folded it neatly, placed it inside my purse, and walked out of the bank. Because for the first time, I wasn't carrying hope, I was carrying proof. And before Christmas arrived, that single piece of paper would turn my family's greatest celebration into their greatest mistake. Over the next several weeks, I said almost nothing. That wasn't because I was afraid, it was because Grandpa had asked me to wait. For the first time in my life, keeping quiet wasn't avoiding conflict, it was following his final instructions. Every few days, Daniel called with another update about the sale. Every conversation sounded more confident than the last. "The buyers love the lake view," he'd tell me. "They're talking about building luxury vacation homes." Mom had already started talking about how she'd spend her share of the money. Emily was looking at beach vacations online. Listening to them plan a future built on something they didn't actually own felt surreal, almost like watching people celebrate winning a lottery ticket before checking the numbers. About 2 weeks later, Mr. Collins called my office. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Claire, I thought you should know. Your mother signed the listing agreement this morning." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. "Did you tell her?" I asked. "No," he answered. "Arthur's instructions haven't changed, and neither have mine." I thanked him before hanging up. Looking through my office window, I realized Grandpa hadn't just trusted me with the cabin, he had trusted me with the truth. That was a much heavier responsibility. Life outside the family continued as normal. I met clients, balanced payroll reports, filed tax returns, and answered emails. Yet every evening when I locked my office, I found myself driving out to the cabin. I still had my own set of keys because technically I was already the owner. Walking through those familiar rooms felt different now. Not because I owned them, but because I finally understood why Grandpa had wanted me to protect them. Every chair had a story. Every photograph on the wall reminded me of a different summer. The old porch swing still creaked exactly the way it had when I was a little girl. I couldn't imagine bulldozers replacing all of it with vacation rentals. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself standing inside Grandpa's workshop. His tools still hung neatly on the wall, each one exactly where he'd left it. I smiled as I remembered how frustrated I used to become whenever I borrowed one and forgot to return it. Grandpa never got angry. He'd simply laugh and say, "Everything has a place, even people." At the time, I thought he was talking about screwdrivers and hammers. Now, I wasn't so sure. As I cleaned dust from one of the shelves, I noticed an old cigar box tucked behind several paint cans. Curious, I pulled it down and opened the lid. Inside were dozens of photographs, some nearly 50 years old. There were pictures of Grandpa building the cabin with his own hands, Grandma planting the first apple tree, my mother as a teenager sitting on the dock laughing, Daniel catching his first fish, Emily running barefoot through the garden, and dozens of photographs of me helping Grandpa fix fences, stack firewood, and paint the porch. Looking through those pictures, I realized something heartbreaking. Our family hadn't always been divided. Once upon a time, we had all loved this place. Near the bottom of the box, I found one final photograph. It had been taken only a year earlier. Grandpa and I were sitting on the porch drinking coffee, completely unaware someone had taken the picture from the yard. Written neatly across the back in Grandpa's handwriting were 8 simple words. The person who stays becomes part of the place. I held that photograph for a long time. It wasn't about ownership. It never had been. To Grandpa, belonging wasn't something written on a deed. It was something earned through years of showing up. Driving home that evening, my phone rang again. This time it was Emily. She sounded unusually excited. "Claire, guess what?" she asked before I could even say hello. "Mom accepted the offer today." I stayed quiet. Emily laughed. "Can you believe it? $680,000. That's more than anyone expected." She was practically shouting with excitement now. "We're celebrating at Christmas. Mom's inviting everyone. She says after everything's finalized, we can finally move on." Move on. Those 2 words stayed with me long after the call ended. Move on from Grandpa, move on from the cabin, move on from every memory that place held. For them, it was the end of an estate. For me, it felt like the end of a lifetime. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived at my office. It was from the title company handling the sale. Inside was a routine notification addressed to the legal owner of the property, informing them that final closing documents would soon require their signature. I smiled the moment I saw it, because the letter wasn't addressed to my mother or Daniel or anyone else in my family. It was addressed to Claire Morgan. At that exact moment, I realized something none of them had. The sale wasn't just built on a lie, it was about to collapse under the weight of the truth. And Christmas dinner was only 10 days away. The week before Christmas, my family was happier than I had seen them in years. Every phone call seemed to begin with the cabin and end with money. Mom had already picked out new kitchen cabinets. Daniel was talking about investing in a rental property outside the city. Emily had booked a vacation to Hawaii for the following summer, even though none of the money had actually reached their bank accounts yet. They spoke about Grandpa's cabin as though it were already a memory, something that belonged to the past. Listening to them, I realized they had already started spending an inheritance that had never legally been theirs. I never argued. I never corrected them. Every time someone asked if I was all right, I smiled and said I was fine. The truth was, I wasn't pretending anymore. I was simply waiting. Grandpa hadn't spent years preparing everything just for me to ruin it by acting too soon. Every document was already signed. Every legal step had already been completed. Time was on my side. For once in my life, I didn't need to defend myself. I only needed to be patient. 3 days before Christmas, my phone rang while I was finishing payroll for one of my clients. It was Mr. Collins. He sounded calm, almost relieved. "Claire, I thought you'd like to know. The buyers scheduled the final closing." I looked up from my desk. "When?" "The 26th. The day after Christmas." I couldn't help smiling. "They're going to be disappointed." Mr. Collins laughed softly. "I imagine they will." Then his voice became more serious. "Arthur left one final instruction for me." I leaned back in my chair. "What was it?" "He told me, if Claire ever has to choose between revenge and dignity, I know she'll choose dignity." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. After we hung up, I found myself staring at Grandpa's photograph sitting on the corner of my desk. Even after he was gone, he still believed in me. Sometimes, more than I believed in myself. 2 days before Christmas, I drove out to the cabin. Fresh snow covered the driveway. The lake had frozen completely. The cedar trees surrounding the property stood perfectly still beneath the winter sky. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything looked exactly the way Grandpa had left it. His reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair. The old calendar still hung open in the kitchen. A half-finished crossword puzzle remained on the coffee table. For a moment, it almost felt as though he had simply gone outside to gather firewood. I walked slowly through every room, touching the walls, the bookshelves, the worn wooden railing leading upstairs. Every corner held a memory. Every room carried part of my childhood. I eventually made myself a cup of coffee using Grandpa's old enamel pot. Then I carried it onto the porch. The lake was silent. The wind barely moved. For nearly an hour, I simply sat there, thinking, remembering, listening. Finally, I stood, locked the front door, slipped the key into my pocket, and quietly whispered, "I made you a promise. I'm going to keep it." Christmas morning arrived wrapped in fresh snow. The entire town looked like something printed on the front of a holiday card. Children played outside. Church bells echoed through the streets. Neighbors waved as I drove toward my parents' house. Everything looked peaceful. Only I knew. By the end of the day, nothing inside my family would ever be the same again. Before leaving my apartment, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside rested Grandpa's leather folder. I carefully removed every document: the recorded deed, the transfer papers, the title company's notification, Grandpa's handwritten letter. I checked each page one final time before sliding everything neatly back into the folder. Then I placed it inside my purse. Not because I wanted to embarrass anyone, because I knew. Eventually, the truth would need a voice, and those papers would speak much louder than I ever could. When I arrived at my parents' house, nearly every parking space along the street was already filled. Laughter spilled through the front door before I even knocked. Mom greeted me with an enthusiastic hug. "There you are. I was beginning to think you weren't coming." "I wouldn't miss Christmas," I replied with a smile. She looked at me for a moment, almost studying my face, as if she expected to find sadness there. Instead, she found something she wasn't expecting: peace. Inside, Daniel was opening another bottle of wine. Emily was helping set dessert on the kitchen counter. Relatives filled every chair in the dining room. Someone had Christmas music playing softly in the background. For a few minutes, it almost felt like every other holiday we'd ever shared. Then, dinner began. Halfway through the meal, Mom stood up. She gently tapped her wine glass with a spoon. The room slowly became quiet. She smiled proudly around the table. "I just want to say, this year has been difficult for all of us. We lost Arthur." She paused, allowing everyone to lower their heads for a brief moment. Then her smile returned. "But life moves forward." Daniel lifted his wine glass. "So does $680,000. Several people laughed. Mom laughed too. Then, very slowly, she turned toward me. The smile on her face became familiar. It was the same smile I'd seen my entire life, the smile she wore whenever she believed she had won. She raised her glass a little higher, looked directly into my eyes, and said, "I'm just grateful we finally sold your grandfather's cabin." Mom raised her wine glass a little higher and smiled around the table. "I'm just grateful we finally sold your grandfather's cabin," she said. "It's time we all moved on." Several people nodded in agreement. Daniel lifted his own glass with a grin. "Grandpa would have wanted us to enjoy it," he said. Emily laughed softly before adding, "Honestly, I never thought we'd get that much for the property." Around the table, glasses touched, people smiled, and conversations began all over again. To everyone else, it was a celebration. To me, it felt like I was watching the final scene of a play where only one person had read the ending. I quietly picked up my wine glass, took one slow sip, and placed it back on the table. The movement was so calm that it immediately caught my mother's attention. She looked at me with the same smile she'd worn all evening and tilted her head slightly. "Claire," she said, "you haven't said a word all night." I smiled politely. "I've just been listening." She laughed. "Well, you don't have to look so serious. I know the cabin meant a lot to you, but life moves on. I nodded slowly before asking a question so simple that nobody at the table expected it. Can I ask something? My mother shrugged. Of course. I looked directly at her. Who bought the cabin? Daniel answered before she could. Some investment company. He waved his hand dismissively. Doesn't really matter who they are. They offered the highest price. Emily smiled. Honestly, they probably plan to tear it down and build luxury vacation homes. That's what everyone does around the lake now. My mother nodded proudly. At least we sold it before property values changed. I listened quietly, then asked another question. Did any of you ever meet the buyer? The room became slightly quieter. Daniel frowned. No? Why would we? I nodded again. So, none of you actually knows who owns Grandpa's cabin? For the first time all evening, nobody answered immediately. My mother looked confused. Claire, where are these questions coming from? I didn't answer her. Instead, I reached down beside my chair and picked up my purse, slowly. I removed Grandpa's leather folder and placed it gently on the dining table. Nobody spoke. Even the children stopped eating as every pair of eyes followed the folder. Daniel laughed nervously. What's this? I looked at him calmly. The truth. I opened the folder carefully. Grandpa had always taught me that important papers deserved respect, so I handled every page exactly the way he used to. I removed the first document and slid it across the table toward my mother. Read the first line. She barely looked at it. Claire, this really isn't the time. I smiled gently. I think you'll disagree after you read it. Daniel reached across the table, picked up the document, and scanned the page quickly. At first, nothing happened. Then I watched every bit of color slowly disappear from his face. His eyes returned to the top of the page, then back down again, as if reading the same sentence twice might somehow change it. Mom noticed immediately. Daniel, what is it? He didn't answer. Without saying a word, he handed her the paper. She adjusted her glasses, looked down, and smiled for just a second before the smile completely disappeared. Her lips parted slightly. Her hands began to tremble. She whispered one word so quietly that only those closest to her could hear it. No. Emily leaned forward. Mom, what's wrong? Mom looked up at me instead of answering. Her voice had become almost a whisper. Claire, she said, what is this? I folded my hands together on the table before speaking. It's the recorded deed to Grandpa's cabin. Nobody moved. The cabin was transferred into my name. I continued quietly. 18 months before Grandpa passed away. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I'd ever experienced. My uncle slowly removed his glasses. My aunt covered her mouth with one hand. Daniel stood up so suddenly that his chair scraped loudly across the wooden floor. That's impossible, he said. Grandpa would have told us. I shook my head. No, he wouldn't have. Then I removed the second document from the folder and placed it beside the first. This is the property transfer agreement, I said. Signed, witnessed, recorded with the county, and completed while Grandpa was still healthy. Daniel picked it up with shaking hands. He searched every page, every signature, every date, desperately hoping to find a mistake. There wasn't one. Finally, my mother looked directly into my eyes. For the first time all evening, there was no confidence left in her voice, only confusion. If you already owned the cabin? She asked quietly. Why didn't you tell us? I looked at Grandpa's handwriting on the envelope still resting inside the folder. Then I looked back at her, because Grandpa asked me not to. I reached into the folder one final time and removed his handwritten letter. Actually, I said softly, I think he'd rather answer that question himself. I unfolded the letter carefully. Every person at the table watched without saying a word. Even the Christmas music playing softly in the next room suddenly seemed very far away. I took a slow breath, looked once around the table, and began reading Grandpa's final words aloud. I unfolded Grandpa's letter slowly. For a moment, I simply looked at his handwriting. It felt strange knowing these were the last words he had ever planned for all of us to hear together. I took a deep breath, then began reading. If this letter is being read aloud, then my family has reached exactly the moment I expected. Some of you will feel angry. Some of you will feel betrayed. Before you blame Claire, understand one thing. Every decision I made was mine alone. She didn't ask for this cabin. She didn't persuade me. She didn't even know I had transferred it into her name until after I was gone. The room remained perfectly still. Nobody interrupted. Nobody even looked away. The only sound was my voice, and the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. For years, I've listened to conversations about this cabin. Almost every visit ended with someone telling me how much money the land was worth. Very few people asked whether I was happy living here. Very few asked if I needed anything. Claire never came because she expected something in return. She came because she believed an old man shouldn't have to drink his morning coffee alone. She repaired broken fences with me. She balanced my checkbook every spring. She sat beside me when I was sick. She stayed long after everyone else had gone home. She never once asked what she would inherit. That is why she inherited the cabin. I stopped reading for a second. My voice had begun to shake. Looking up, I saw my mother quietly wiping tears from her eyes. Daniel stared at the table without moving. Emily had both hands covering her mouth. I continued. If you're wondering why I didn't divide the property equally, the answer is simple. Equality and fairness are not always the same thing. A gift should never be measured by who wants it the most. It should be measured by who protects it the best. This cabin was never my greatest investment. It was my greatest memory. I couldn't leave those memories to the highest bidder. I had to leave them to the person who understood their value. The room felt even quieter than before. Nobody argued, nobody complained. Grandpa had answered every question before anyone had the chance to ask it. Near the bottom of the page, his handwriting became slightly less steady, but every word was still perfectly clear. To my children, I hope one day you understand that love isn't proven by inheritance. It's proven by presence. If you regret anything after I'm gone, don't regret losing this cabin. Regret the weekends you could have spent here but chose not to. Regret the conversations we never had because money seemed more important than time. Money always returns. Time never does. I lowered the letter for a moment. There wasn't a dry eye anywhere around the table. Even my uncle, a man I had never seen cry in my entire life, quietly removed his glasses and wiped his face. Then I read Grandpa's final paragraph. Claire, if you've chosen to read this letter instead of arguing, then you proved me right one final time. Don't let this cabin divide the family. If they apologize, forgive them. If they don't, forgive them anyway. Carrying anger is far heavier than carrying responsibility. Protect this place. Fill it with laughter. Invite everyone who truly wants to be here. And remember me only when something makes you smile. That will be more than enough. The letter ended there. I carefully folded the paper exactly the way Grandpa had folded it years before, and placed it back inside the envelope. For what felt like an entire minute, nobody spoke. Finally, my mother stood up from her chair. She walked slowly around the table until she was standing beside me. Her eyes were red from crying. She looked older than she had only an hour earlier. Without saying a word, she reached for my hand. Claire, she whispered, I'm so sorry. Those 3 words carried more honesty than anything she had ever said to me. I spent so many years thinking I was doing the right thing. I kept telling myself you were stronger, that you didn't need as much help. I never stopped to ask whether you wanted help, or whether you simply stopped asking because nobody was listening. I squeezed her hand gently. I'm not angry anymore, Mom. She shook her head. You had every right to be. Before I could answer, Daniel slowly stood up. For once, he didn't have a speech prepared. He looked embarrassed, almost ashamed. I don't deserve that cabin, he admitted quietly. The truth is, I hadn't spent a full day there in years. Every time I visited, I was already thinking about selling it. I convinced myself Grandpa was being stubborn, when really, I was the one who had stopped seeing what made that place special. Emily walked over next. Tears were still running down her face. I can't remember the last time I visited Grandpa without checking my phone every few minutes, she said softly. I kept saying I was busy, but somehow I always had time for everything except him. No one tried to defend themselves. There was nothing left to defend. The truth had already done its work. A few days later, the title company officially canceled the sale. The buyers were disappointed, but understanding. The cabin had never legally been available for purchase. The money everyone had already begun planning for simply disappeared, as though it had never existed. Strangely, nobody argued, nobody blamed me. Because after hearing Grandpa's letter, they finally understood this had never been about real estate. It had always been about relationships. Spring arrived a few months later. The snow melted from the roof, birds returned to the lake, and the apple trees beside the cabin began blooming again. One Saturday morning, I invited the entire family for lunch. I wasn't sure who would come. Every one of them did. Daniel spent the afternoon repairing the old dock, without anyone asking him to. Emily helped clean Grandpa's workshop, carefully placing every tool back where it belonged. Mom sat quietly on the porch, smiling as the grandchildren played in the yard exactly the way we once had. As the sun began setting across the lake, I found myself standing alone beside Grandpa's favorite rocking chair. For just a moment, I could almost picture him sitting there, coffee in one hand, a gentle smile on his face, watching his family laugh together again. And I realized something that had taken me an entire year to understand. Grandpa never left me the cabin because I needed a place to live. He left it to me because he believed I could turn a piece of property back into a home. Every Christmas since then, our family gathers at the cabin instead of my mother's house. We cook together, laugh together, tell Grandpa's old stories, and watch the children run down to the frozen lake exactly the way we once did. Nobody talks about selling the property anymore, because we finally understand what Grandpa had known all along. A family's greatest inheritance is never the house. It's making sure there's always a place where the family still wants to come home.